Hey, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Oh, there, I can see that we're live now.
We are indeed. This is my first time live on Facebook. This is exciting.
Wow, amazing. See, so you have 200 people now here in Zoom, and it will probably increase to 250 to 300 later. And then in Facebook, we usually generally have around 90 to 100 live attendees, and then more views immediately after because people just keep on sharing. So for everyone who's attending here, please feel free to share this content. We are now on live. You can check us at facebook.com/mypstd, and the video will be running as soon as you go to that Facebook page. So please be generous in sharing to other people who you think will also benefit from this learning experience. Okay? All right, so we will now officially start. I'm John Baluyot, the president of the Philippine Society for Talent Development. So I'd like to welcome everyone. So we now have around 202 attendees here in Zoom. And in Facebook, I don't know, I don't have a visual, but I'll tell you later. We have, I think, around 400 registered attendees in total in the last few days. So 250%. Probably we will achieve 60% today attendance rate. Let me now introduce to you our very esteemed speaker, Ms. Michelle Ockers. So Michelle is the learning and strategy expert and learning capability builder and independent learning and development professional who under Rethink Learning program. I hope I got that right, Michelle. Uh,
Rethink learning. Yes, I'm talking a lot about rethinking learning at the moment, and it's something I've been talking about for several years, but now is a good time to be rethinking learning.
right. Michelle, and I believe you're also the president of AITD, or Australia Institute of Training and Development,
Just
divisional
for
president
Queensland, we
for
yes, we
Queensland.
have regions. So for Queensland, that's a pro bono, that's a voluntary role, and we
Right.
organise local events and networking similar to what you're doing here.
Right, that's amazing. And that's why we're pretty much aligned to our cause and our vision
Mm,
too. So thank you so much for doing this for us. I would now gladly transfer the slides to you.
thank you. I'll just pull up my slides and we'll get
Sure.
started with today's conversation
Yes.
about rethinking learning through disruption. And I just want to say how impressed I am with the level of interest from your Talent Development Society, the HR and learning professionals who have been joining this series and the work that PSTD has been doing in putting these on. Um, I think the way we get stronger and keep progressing is in community and working with each other and collaborating and having these kind of conversations. So it's a wonderful contribution to be making right now when I think, we're all making this big effort to reach out. That physical distance doesn't mean social distance. It doesn't mean we're disconnected. And it just feels like it's a fantastic point in time. As much as I would never wish these events to have happened, and I don't think anyone would wish things to be the way they are, the level of connection and reaching out and the opportunity it presents us to bring the best of our humanity to our work and to help unleash potential in people and to be of service. I think there's an opportunity to really rise and do some great things through our work as learning professionals at the moment. And I'd like to share some of what I'm seeing and some of the ways that I think we can really be very effective right now and in coming months. So we're going to start with a poll. And this is really about understanding where were we before COVID-19 started, and in particular, this big switch from face-to-face to virtual learning. So if we can get the poll open, Nat, that would be wonderful. And if everyone can enter one of these options, how much of your learning delivery was being done face-to-face prior to COVID-19? 25%, 50%, 51 to 75, or over 75. So if people can choose one of those, and there's some
Um,
really good, go ahead.
sorry.
Yes, John.
Do I just tell you once the voting is over, Michelle?
No, what's going to happen when the voting is over? So we'll give it maybe a minute, and then Nat's going to close the poll after a minute, and he'll share the results and everyone will be able to see them. So I know we can't, like as participants, I can't see all the results either, so it'll be a bit of a surprise at the end. Right. But there's some global benchmarking I'm going to share with you in a moment, to talk about some work done by a company called Towards Maturity, which some of the participants here may be aware of, and we'll share a link to some of their research. They recently renamed Emerald Works. So if people come across Emerald Works rather than Towards Maturity, it's the same organisation. And Towards Maturity started about 15, 16 years ago, and they've been doing benchmarking research with learning teams, learning professionals around the globe for 15 years. So they've been able to monitor a lot of what's happening in learning in organisations over that period of time. And there's some data I'm going to share with you in a moment about how much learning across their last data set, which was over 800 L&D leaders over a 12-month period, how much was still being done face-to-face delivery. It'll be interesting to see the data from this group and see how that compares. But what's really fascinating is, you know, we've had this incredible interest in learning technologies for many years, and we speak a lot about learning in the flow of work and moving from everything being about training to finding other ways to support and enable people to learn. Well, we're going to see how much that has actually led into a shift in the kind of delivery methods that we actually do use for learning in organisations. So Nat, if you can close the poll and share the results, let's have a look at what those results say. Isn't that fascinating? So despite this interest in learning technologies, in looking at different ways of supporting and enabling learning for this group, the strongest response was over 75% of your delivery was still being done face-to-face prior to COVID-19. So 66% of you, 2/3 of those who voted in the poll, have said this was the result. Which is a really high number when you think about it. When you think about all of a sudden, bang, all of a sudden, in the space of, I don't know what it was like in the Philippines, but within a week here in Australia, the physical distancing rules were introduced and we could no longer gather people in groups for face-to-face training. So everything shifted so quickly. So we're going to have a little look at what that means and what the data is from the much bigger global data set from Towards Maturity. So Nat, thank you for that. If you could close the poll for us and we'll have a look at that benchmarking data. Thank you so much. So this is a snapshot from the last report. As I said, they've renamed to Emerald Works, and there's a link in the chat box if anyone's interested in taking a copy of that link to look at that report. What their research found was that as at the end of 2019, over 55% of learning delivery was still being done in the classroom. And actually that sample size was 1,123, wasn't much bigger than 800, sorry. So that is not shifting very quickly despite this interest in learning technology. So you've got in this group, 2/3 of you are saying over 75% of your learning delivery was being done in classrooms, which means that 1/3 of you had lower than 75%. So I'm curious, and if we can pop in the chat box, besides classroom, face-to-face classroom delivery, prior to COVID-19, what other approaches to learning were you using in your organisation? What was the most often used? Anywhere between 1 and 3 maximum. E-learning, yeah, absolutely. Online learning modules, that's also very common, delivered through a learning management system. Mobile learning apps are becoming increasingly common and being used in a whole range of ways. One of my favourites there, social learning. I love social learning, collaboration, knowledge sharing between people. Someone's mentioned MOOCs. MOOCs were so hot back in around 2012, 2013. And I think the market for MOOCs, massive online open courses, has really matured. MOOCs are really interesting because they are sort of generic content. Like, for instance, if any of you are using platforms such as LinkedIn Learning or Skillsoft, they're generic content as well. So there's a bit of effort you need to go to make sure that you can textualize it for your organization and for your people so that they can get some support to apply the learning out of that. Kim's got some really good examples then. There, the job rotation, job enhancement, immersion, which is learning from experience. Just want to check in, Nat, that you've seen a request about sharing the slides on the biggest screen. I think we are probably sharing as big as we can, so it might be at the participant side. You might want to look at maximizing the display. Communities of practice, brown bag sessions. So there's a nice range there. Outside of face-to-face learning, we've got people using e-learning. We've got people using approaches where we're connecting people to each other, be it through mentoring, knowledge sharing, be it through communities of practice, huddles. Echo sessions is interesting. I've not heard of that, Ludi. So if you can maybe type in the chat box for us what an echo session is. A couple of people have talked about echo sessions. And then the workplace experience with job immersions, job rotations, stretch opportunities. And when we take away face-to-face learning, all of those options remain open to us, even in terms of job rotation and stretch assignments. They're all things we can work into a virtual environment. And of course, we're looking at taking things that were done in classrooms face-to-face and thinking about how can we take them and convert them into other approaches in a virtual environment, and what are the equivalents and how do we bridge? Ludi, thank you. Echoing is what you learned from a training you attended to another group of participants. Yeah, you know, it's often said that one of the best ways to learn is to teach someone else. And I think that's, I've just not heard the term echo. So thank you for clarifying that. I just learned something as well. So let's talk about the idea of the adoption curve. This may be something that's familiar to many of you. This is like a generic innovation adoption curve. So be it a new product, a new service, or be it practices, workplace practices, or in this case, we're going to talk about adoption of alternative learning practices. So practices other than face-to-face training in particular. They tend to follow, new approaches tend to follow this adoption curve, where you have a very early group of people who are the innovators, the ones who get in there and try out new things and help show us the way and maybe do the trial and error and figure out what didn't work and what did work. You know, things get ironed out and refined and finessed. And the early adopters are the group next who pick up the things that the innovators have been doing once they get a sense that, hey, there's enough interest in this and we can see some examples of how this might work, and they'll adopt them. And then gradually over time, those in the early majority, late majority will start adopting new practices. This curve applies, as I said, to all sorts of practices, products, services, technologies. It's a well-known phenomenon, well-studied phenomenon. And it also applies in the world of learning and development. But what's really interesting is the pace of movement between the different stages of the adoption curve. I want to share, and I'd be interested if anyone is familiar with Donald H. Taylor's Learning and Development Global Sentiment Survey, which has been running for 7 years. If anyone is familiar with it or has voted in it, can you just let me know in the chat box? Just give us a yes in the chat box. I'm curious about whether people in the Philippines are aware of this particular survey. It is sentiment. It's one question. Don provides a list of 15 options and says, you know, what will be hot in the workplace in learning and development in 2020. So it's not a question about what should we be paying attention to, but what are we likely to be paying attention to? So people are saying it's new to them. So I know there's a lot of activity in the chat box. We did pop a link to the survey, and you will be getting a recording. So you'll be able to check out Don's survey and download the survey. What's really interesting, voters it's just one question. What do you think will be hot in the workplace in L&D in 2020? So there will be things in there like, I think this last survey had, artificial intelligence, micro-learning, consulting more widely with the business as a practice, curation, so 15 different things, and then another option. People can choose 3 options out of that list of 15. So last year there were, as you can see, over 2,200 voters from across 86 countries. Now, what's really interesting is that because Don has been doing this survey for 7 years, he's been able to look at what the shift has been amongst what he calls 2 groups, the innovators and the early adopters. So what he's done is when he puts out the survey, he puts it out first through social media. And his thinking is that social media is a place where those in the learning profession who are probably more at the progressive edge of the profession are having conversations, are sharing new practices, investigating different approaches, that they're going to be the ones who are responding through the social media link. And then he has a number of databases where he puts out a request through emails. He has colleagues who send out requests as well. And he feels these are sort of the early adopters. And what he's noticed is that over time, something that this group, the innovators, pick up on, if it is going to move from the innovators being interested to it to slowly moving into more mainstream adoption, it takes 1 to 2 years to move from innovators to early adopters. But then he's not quite sure how many years it's taking to move into the early majority. And there's some practices that the innovators and early adopters have picked up that really are very slow on the take up into the majority in learning and development. So sometimes we feel like we're having these conversations over and over, things we're interested in that maybe aren't being picked up on or utilised as widely. Hence, we still have 55% of training being done in the classroom. So this isn't because we don't know what good practice looks like. There's plenty of examples, stories, case studies about people who are adopting different practices, innovating, evaluating, measuring, figuring out what makes a difference in their organisation. But there's something getting in the way of more widespread adoption of a number of practices. And before I move on the slides, I just noticed in the chat box, some people were saying that the link wasn't working. There will be a full list of links sent out in email with the recording. So you'll be able to explore all of these fabulous resources for yourself. So what's getting in the way? I'm going to share some findings from another really good Towards Maturity research report, and all of their annual research reports are a free download. In 2019, their annual research report was called The Transformation Journey, and they specifically looked to analyse what are the barriers that are getting in the way of learning and development teams achieving their aspirations, because our aspirations are magnificent. You know, we do genuinely aspire to make a difference to productivity, to make a difference to the culture of the organisations we work in. We have these high aspirations, but year on year, the Towards Maturity research has shown that we've struggled to really achieve our aspirations. So they've really investigated what's getting in the way. And the first thing that's getting in the way, digital disruption, is the technology and adoption of technology itself. There've been barriers within organisations to embracing some of the technology and to making it work. And sometimes those barriers are about cost, sometimes they're about internet bandwidth, for instance. And I can expect, if we maybe started a little bit of a chat, and we'll have a chat about these barriers in a moment, that some of you will be able to say, look, here's what gets in the way from a technology perspective of me adopting new approaches in the organisation. Another thing that people report is cultural resistance. And what I mean by that is, as a learning professional, you may want to use different approaches. You may want to do more, for instance, with communities of practice. You may want to do more with social learning practices, with learning in the flow of work, with online forums and self-help resources. But people in your organisation that maybe are saying, I want to be trained. I want you to train me. Managers maybe are saying, I've got a performance problem. I want a course to fix the problem, when perhaps, skills and knowledge aren't really the reason for the performance problem, but it's easier just to ask for a course. So sometimes we have learning professionals who want to be progressive, who want to introduce new approaches, but they struggle to get their stakeholders to agree to try things differently. There's not enough stretch in the willingness of some of the stakeholders to just give something new a try. And then, of course, sometimes learning and development readiness itself is an issue. So it would be interesting. I'll chat for a little bit about what I mean by learning and development readiness. And thank you, Earl. You've said, I think cultural resistance is a problem you can relate to. It would be interesting to maybe have some chat in the chat box around what are you finding if you have tried to shift approaches in your organisation as some of the barriers you face. Now, by L&D readiness, I'm talking about both the mindset and more particularly the skill set of learning and development professionals. As we move away from formal training, the range of solutions that we could use requires a much broader range of skills. And the pace at which technology in particular is developing makes it hard for us to keep our skill set current with the different range of options that we might want to use. So relative to where we need to be with our skill set, we are struggling to stay abreast of change. So just a couple here, we've got somebody who's talking about seconding the motion on cultural resistance and some concern about learning and development readiness. I do a lot of work with capability building with learning and development teams, and it's quite a challenge. And these days, no one learning professional can be skilled in everything that a learning team needs to do. We have a lot more specialisation due to this shift in the range of approaches we're trying to use to enable and support learning. So in the session today, that's sort of by way of scene setting, one of the things I wanted to say, I'll just go back to this slide, is that because of physical distancing and how quickly it was introduced, I think it's just bursting through some of these barriers, because organisations are having to figure out how to overcome technology barriers so that people can work remotely. I've heard of some organisations who've taken whole call centres and in the space of 2 weeks figured out how to set their call centres up so people are working from home, and they've never done that before. And I think in terms of cultural resistance, face-to-face training is not an option at the moment. So out of necessity, people are going to be a lot more open to trying new things. I call it the great unfreezing. There's this moment in time where people are going to be less resistant to doing things differently. Now, our own skill set is something we're going to have to be comfortable with, trying things and appreciating that right now it doesn't matter if they're not perfect. And that because so much is changing so quickly, there is less expectation that everything is going to be perfect. And we have to give ourselves permission to try new things as well, and to experiment and to learn quickly. So doing things quickly but also smartly are both important right now. So I'm going to move us on then, having set the scene, to looking at the 3 horizons that I'm seeing for the disruption we're going through. The idea of the innovative middle, which I think is our key area of opportunity, and some thoughts on how we might emerge stronger as a profession and stronger in terms of the role of learning in organisations than we were coming into the start of 2020. So let's look at the 3 horizons. And I've got a question here for the chat box. In the first 2 to 3 weeks after physical distancing was introduced, what did your learning team do? What tasks were you doing? How were you supporting people, if indeed you were? Because in some teams, there were more immediate priorities with operations centres and so on. So people were taken out of their learning roles temporarily. But assuming you're still working in your learning role, what were you doing for that first 2 to 3 weeks after physical distancing was introduced? Doris is saying setting up a platform for communication first. It became really vital, right, that we could connect our people through virtual communication and collaboration tools, exploring the platforms that were available, putting more effort into e-learning, encouraging people to use what was available there. Somebody's commented, you know, in a lot of cases we had resources, platforms available, but they were being underutilized. There's a thank you to everyone who's sharing here, working on backlogs. That's okay, that's interesting. So for some organizations, for some learning teams, it was an opportunity perhaps to catch up a little while everybody in their organization rearranged themselves and got used to working in a different way. And I can see a lot of people are talking about encouraging staff to engage with what was already there. There was this, you know, stuff being underutilized potentially and people not really aware of it. So this period, I'm calling the fierce urgency of now. This was a period of initial response, the concept of triage, what's important to get done right now, how do we help our people to adjust immediately? I've been doing short interviews with a range of learning leaders, mostly in Australia and New Zealand, but also in Thailand. I have some teams I work with there. And some of the things they've told me that they've faced is, firstly, you know, there's just way too information coming at us, and helping our people to filter the information and get to what's really important has been vital. Secondly, people are just overwhelmed with using the new technology, and we have to help them to figure out how to use it. Just helping people to adapt to this new normal, and really not knowing how long it's going to last either, but getting people's head around it. Questioning what are the most important topics. A lot of effort going now into mental health and well-being at this period of time to help people deal with the emotional reaction and the impact of being separated from their co-workers. And one learning leader has sort of said, look, I'm a little bit disorientated myself and waiting for the dust to settle. So the next question then, you may well be beyond that initial period. So I think we're on the cusp of entering a new period now where the dust has settled a little bit. And the question is, what is your learning team doing now? So after that first 2 to 3 weeks, what have you started turning your mind to, and what is your team focusing on now? And while people respond to that in the chat box, assuming it's shifted from that first 2 to 3 weeks, I'll share some of what I've heard in my conversations with learning leaders. What I'm hearing is that there's an increasing openness to change, and people are starting to experiment and trying new approaches and getting their head around the technology and the infrastructure and what have we got and what else do we need and how we tie it all together. So here's some direct quotes from the discussions I've been having. You know, it's opening up opportunities that we've been slowly chipping away at. And that gets to the point around cultural resistance. People are open to engaging with, you know, the content you've already curated, the resources you've already got available, the e-learning you've got available. Karen, that's such an interesting comment that you weren't a fan of digital learning now, but now you appreciate it better. So sometimes these shifts are shifts we have to go through ourselves as well, right? Sometimes the first mindset shift is within ourselves before we can bring others along on the journey with us. So another comment I had was, and this is really fascinating, one person said to me, I have 100 times more access to subject matter experts than usual, even though I'm physically distant from them. And it's so ironic that I've got more access to people because there's more importance being placed on my role in helping people right now. I'm finding learning professionals more in demand than ever right now. This next one is interesting because it's that balance, you know, what I was saying earlier. The ground is there to experiment and try new things, but if you want it to be perfect, you're going to struggle to make the most of the opportunity and openness that is here right now. So part, again, of the mindset shift for ourselves as learning professionals to lead others in this time and to be of the greatest service we can be is to let go of the need for things to be perfect and to try things out right now. And I love this quote. This actually was from someone who leads a team in Bangkok. And she said, we won't go back to business as usual, go back to a better normal. And I love the idea of aspiring that somehow through this period, and we don't know how long this middle period is going to be, and then as physical distancing eases and face-to-face training is an option, that is open to us again, but maybe not the default option to the extent it has been, we've got the opportunity to create a better normal, a better experience of learning for our people in the organisations that we work with and support. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the book Anti-Fragile, but it's about black swan events, which are rare events. Events that cause incredible pressure, and just like diamonds are formed through the combination of heat and pressure, and they end up being this beautiful thing that we look to in our society as something very precious. If you're fragile, you break under pressure. If you're robust, you bounce back. But if you're anti-fragile, you can come out of adversity stronger than before. And I think there's a real opportunity for us with learning and organisations to come out of this period, whenever it ends, as better than before and stronger than before. So these three horizons then that I'm seeing, the first one is this fierce urgency of now. The opportunity here is that we are of immediate service, that we help our organisations to make this transition quickly. And I think for most organisations, things are starting to settle down and we're passing through this horizon. The risk here is that we repeat bad practice or we invent new bad practice. So I have heard of one organisation where the learning leader was asked to take a one-day face-to-face classroom course and turn it into a one-day course delivered in a virtual classroom, and do it no differently, which of course is just creating a new bad practice. And I know you guys have got some sessions next week around digital learning and virtual learning, and that many of you will appreciate that there is a big difference between facilitated sessions in virtual settings from face to face. This next period, this innovative middle, which I think we're sort of entering into now, I did get a request to show the previous slide. I'll go back to it briefly in a moment. I think there's an opportunity here for innovation, for building new infrastructure, whilst our technology teams are more open to different infrastructure and introducing different infrastructure for us to use. The risk here, though, is that we focus too much on the technology and don't take enough time to experiment with different approaches and get our people used to different approaches. And then there's this aspiration to move into a strategic role into the future, in effect, to emerge stronger than we were before, as I was saying, to be anti-fragile, to use the ideas that Taleb explores in his book, Anti-Fragile. So let's take a look at this innovative middle. What are some of the ways we might be able to take the time to think and work differently as a learning professional during this period? As I said earlier, there are plenty of good examples. There's plenty of case studies, plenty of stories, plenty of evidence of what works with different approaches other than face-to-face training and how to make them work. So I noticed somebody mentioned earlier in the session when they were first joining that they're a listener of my podcast, Learning Uncut. Normally, Learning Uncut is a case study with a learning professional about a solution that they've put in place in their organisation or a new approach to learning that they've implemented that's had impact and success. But in response to the physical distancing and everybody's need to move so quickly from face-to-face training to learning in virtual methods, I was able to reach out to people and put together these short discussions with leading professionals from around the globe about different approaches and how to make them work. So if you look around, there's actually plenty of resources that tell us what good practices look like, and there's opportunity to take those and adapt those. I think the other thing to be aware of in terms of thinking about learning differently is about our mindset and about how we see learning and how we see learners. And this is the mindset of the learning professional. Again, from one of the Towards Maturity reports from 2018, I've gone through that and sort of analysed what is the underlying mindset between those who, on the left of the set of bars at the top, are really still trying to get control of training and are having less impact. And on the right are the organisations that are more sharing responsibility for learning across the organisation and having the kind of impact that many of us aspire to. So some of the key shifts there that I think are really important is about this shift from controlling learning, which in effect is what a lot of classroom training does. It puts a facilitator in control of the learning, to sharing responsibility, which is what approaches such as communities of practice, knowledge sharing, forums, job rotations, connecting people with experts. This is where we're starting to create connected contributors of our people and treat them differently. And I firmly believe that the way we as learning professionals view our people as learners will shape the kinds of approaches we're willing to use. So I'd really encourage you all to kind of take some time to have a look at how you really view your learners. There's actually plenty of evidence that says people are much more capable of managing their own learning than we think they are, we being the learning professionals. People love connection. You only have to look at the way people are reaching out to connect to each other right now, that they have to be physically distant. There is lots of examples of people being very innovative and looking for ways to stay connected to each other. Humans need connection. We crave connection. We learn so much from each other. So one of the key roles of a learning professional who views people as capable, connected learners is we start looking for ways that we can connect people to learn from each other rather than having to be the source of information and instruction. And by concerned, what I mean here is appealing to understanding what concerns people, what matters to them, and providing resources and learning opportunities that address things that really matter to them. And many of you will have heard of the idea of human-centered design and the need to be more people-centric in our work. And this picks up on that theme. So I would challenge you to think about and to reflect on how you view learners. And if you were to truly view learners as capable, connected, and people who have concerns and will seek to address those concerns, how can you then appeal to those characteristics to create really effective learning in virtual environments, and it not all being just about e-learning and just about virtual classrooms with a facilitator at the center of the learning. Now, a lot of these practices, as I said, we can pick up from those who have high performance learning cultures. So this again is from the Towards Maturity research, which talks about the idea of letting go of control of learning and development, helping to connect people and build independent learning in their organisations and the impact of that. So the question is for you, and this is not necessarily for the chat right now, but to be thinking about what can I do in coming weeks and months to be able to encourage people to take more responsibility for their own learning, to find ways to help them to connect with resources, with each other, and to share their knowledge and experience. So we're going to, I just wanted to let you know, I'm exploring some of these. I've got a separate webinar, which I'm running tomorrow, where I'm going a little deeper on some of these ways of thinking and working, which I think will help us to rethink learning both quickly and smartly. And I will be providing a recording for that as well. So if you're interested in learning more, you're very welcome to join that. I'm on LinkedIn and I've been promoting that on LinkedIn. So if you don't get the link right now, you'll be able to find that on LinkedIn. So let's talk about emerging stronger. So let's assume you put yourself in the position where you're trying new things, you're experimenting, you're inviting your people to experience different ways of learning in this period of time. what are some of the approaches that are going to help you to emerge stronger? And one of those is to use this period of time yourself to try new things, to experiment, and to gain conviction that there are things that are worth hanging on to when we move back into an environment where face-to-face training is possible. This is a change model which comes from the world of psychology, which talks about, in order to get yourself ready to make a change, you need to go through a period of what they call pre-contemplation and contemplation. In other words, to be confident yourself that, well, firstly, to be aware that there is a different way of doing things, in this case, a different way of enabling and supporting learning, and then to convince yourself that the effort that it's going to take is worth it. Now, some of you talked about cultural resistance being a challenge. That may have held you back because the effort and the level of exertion to keep having conversations and trying to stretch people can be very draining. But now is a good time to get in and try to make these changes, because people really are more open. So you may find that your assessment of contemplation and is it worth the effort is going to have shifted, and you could find very much that trying some new approaches is going to leave you coming out of this period with conviction and a willingness to continue pursuing these new changes, new approaches to learning. But the other thing that goes with that is being able to communicate the value of different approaches. So as you try new approaches, be thinking about how you can gather data and stories and how you can evaluate the impact of those approaches so that you can continue to communicate their value and encourage that some of these will stay in the mix, and you're not going to end up swinging quite as far back to everything having to be face-to-face training as you were as you came into 2020. And when we talk about communicating value, I'd like you to encourage to think about the different ways we communicate value and the different ways people take in information and build conviction around changes. And this little model here covers the use of models, the use of metaphors, the use of data, and the use of stories as a way of demonstrating value and influencing people. And the idea here is models or metaphor are about big picture thinking. So people who like the big picture will engage more with models and metaphors. Data and story go into more detail. So for some of your stakeholders, they're going to be looking for the data or looking for the stories that show them the specifics of a time when this worked and why did this work and how did this work. The idea of models is about thinking analytically. Some of us like to see a good model, like to have the data and do the analysis, whereas the idea of metaphor and story is more about appealing to intuition, if you like. So there are many ways you can gather data and gather stories, and I would encourage you to be thinking right now, as you try different approaches, what sort of data might you be able to gather? What sort of stories might you be able to gather? How are you going to gather those? Now, I don't have time to go into what all these different approaches are. They're all approaches that we know something about, that you can find more information on. Kirkpatrick is probably the most familiar way of gathering data that we're aware of, the most familiar model. I'd be interested in the chat box, perhaps, if people are using any approaches to evaluation, to gathering data and stories they're finding effective, to share those. But personally, one of the things I've found really powerful is gathering stories. So on the right-hand side, the diagram there, the image, that's actually taken from a video that I made when I was working at Coca-Cola Amatil, and I introduced communities of practice. And it took a little bit of encouragement and finding someone who was, I called them a friend of learning. So someone, a senior leader who was open to different approaches to engage with us in trying a community of practice rather than everything needing to be done via training. And I took a video. After about a year, we had a face-to-face gathering of some of the more senior members, the experts from one of our communities of practice. And I made a short video where I asked them some stories about, tell me about a time when you learned something through this community of practice. What did you learn? How did you learn it? And I shared those stories back, little videos. I shared them back in a range of ways across the organisation. They had more influence than any of the data I gathered about the improvements the community have made or the innovations. So don't underestimate the power of gathering stories and social proof as well. But think about your evaluation strategy right now for the approaches you're using, and how can you do some light touch approaches to gathering some data and some stories that you can use to mount the case to continue working in new ways as we move out of this period. So I'm going to pause. That was a lot of information, a lot of thoughts. What I want to do is a check-in in the chat box. I would like you to share an insight that you've gained from the things I've been sharing with you, the ideas, some of the research and reports that I've shared with you, and an action. What's something you're going to do as a result of that insight? So I don't mind whether you share an insight or an action, but let's have a look in the chat box at what some of people's takeaways are in terms of insights and actions from this topic of rethinking learning through disruption and being someone who can lead that whole process of rethinking learning in your organisation. Thank you, Daphne, because everything is new for everybody. Now is the time to try new things, and it's okay that it's not perfect. That is such a great takeaway. The value of stories. Yeah, Marimel, trying out new tools. It's a great time to try out new tools. And you know, sometimes starting with the tools you've already got in your organisation is a good place to start. We often underutilise what we've already got available to us. Fail fast, yes, and fail smart. Don't just fail fast. You know, I've got an interview coming up in 2 weeks' time on Learning Uncut with the CEO of WD-40, Gary Ridge. And he's introduced the idea of learning moments in the culture at WD-40. So they don't talk about failure. People talk about, I've just had a learning moment, and they share an insight. The power of social proof is coming up, the value of communication. Being empathic, yeah, Lorraine, that's really important right now, right? People are going through a lot of stuff and a lot of change. And I think often too, you know, you don't know what people's home situation is like, and people at home, maybe with young children who can't go to school and trying to work from home or new to technology. A lot of hand-holding and connecting and support and coaching is really valuable right now. And Katie, necessity is the mother of innovation. Absolutely, absolutely. So I can see a couple of people have picked up on the idea of a better normal. I think it's a really great reminder to us how not only can we cope or survive during this period, but how can we thrive? And I think if we come from that as a place of being of service, and that's the mindset we bring to this period of time, and how can I be of service by trying new things? It's very different from the mindset of how can I just take advantage of it. It's really about making a contribution both now and into the future. So I can see we've got some questions in the Q&A, which we will take. I just wanted to put up an offer if anybody would like to book in for a 15-minute conversation with me. I have some slots available in my calendar. If you'd like to talk about how you're rethinking learning in your organisation for a complimentary conversation, this link I think will also be in the email that comes out. But if you want to write down that link, you're welcome to go and have a look at my calendar and book in time for a conversation. I'm very interested to be talking to learning professionals at the moment about what they are finding. So let's have a look at some of those questions. Perhaps, John, what do you think?
Hello. Hi, I'm just going to turn on my video. Can you hear me now?
Absolutely. And I can
Amazing.
see you.
Cool. All right. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Michelle, for number one, for offering this. Like booking a call with you, I think would be such a delight for a lot of the people here, especially as you see they're very engaged simply by asking questions and responding to your questions. The second thing I'd like to bring out is I really appreciate how you said, and I think everyone else in the chat box really appreciate when you said that it's a better normal instead of having a new normal. It gives us a better outlook of what to look at after the crisis is over, hopefully. Um, so let me try to brush through some of the Q&A items here. When you mentioned about the communication value a while ago, one of the things that could communicate value is data. You mentioned in the quadrant. And there's a question here that's very interesting to a lot of people. They asked, in terms of data, will you be able to recommend a certain questionnaire to measure the e-learning readiness of individuals or organizations so that they will be able to share this to their organizations and be able to quantify like the readiness. It's like a needs analysis thing where they will be able to see themselves through a questionnaire.
I'm not aware of a ready-made one. I have developed questionnaires myself sometimes for the introduction of new technologies. And sometimes it's about skill and sometimes it's about confidence. Sometimes, I mean, I would include questions about technology. And if you're asking people to do e-learning from home, you know, do they have good internet? What's the internet bandwidth like? Because some e-learning can be very heavy on internet bandwidth. So I don't have like a ready-made one, but the kind of things I would normally ask about when I'm looking at people's readiness to engage with new technology and new approaches of learning, certainly their confidence with the technology, whether they've used any similar technologies. So I would think about, are there similar consumer technologies that they may well have used?
Right.
Yeah, that would be part of it. But it's also around their willingness and confidence using new technologies or engaging in new ways.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much for that response. Let me just hook that to another question that's very interesting in terms of readiness. So a lot of the slides that you presented, they describe the um, readiness of or non-readiness of learners to cross that digital bridge. The question now by Milton Long here is, how much resistance are you seeing in relation to L&D professionals in terms of transitioning to digital learning?
I think it depends on what your prior experience has been. I see the most resistance amongst long-term classroom trainers who are really great classroom trainers. You know, facilitation is a skill that takes, you know, time to master. And if they haven't had the opportunity to use technology in the classroom, it's quite a bridge to make that shift. But at the same time, I see a lot of learning professionals are very open to trying new technologies. So it's a little bit of a mix. I think, if anything, there are times when we can get really excited about a new technology and want to use the technology and go looking for opportunities to use the technology, rather than asking ourselves, really taking the time to understand what's the problem and what is the need and what is the environment, and then looking for the right solution. So my approach is always to start with what's the problem and what's the need and what's the environment that people need to undertake this learning in, and then find the right technology to match it. But part of the challenge is there are so many technologies available. It's really difficult to keep up to date with all of them.
Mhm.
So some of the bigger learning and development teams have specialist technology teams now for that reason, that they can do the experimentation, the research, and then introduce technologies to the rest of the team. But if you are a small team, a one-person team or a small team, you just don't have the bandwidth. So I think it's not so much resistance as just overwhelm,
Right.
which are different things. In which case, reach out to your external partners, reach out to people in your network who have experience. And that's the value of being part of a network or an organisation such as such as this one, and to
Okay.
reach out to others for help.
Thank you so much. There's another question that has been lingering in the chat box. So you mentioned about not just failing fast, but also failing smart. We think that's a very good hook. Can you expound more a bit on that in the perspective of learning and development practitioners? Where are the areas
Mm.
which you think they can fail fast and fail smart in? Because it's very hard to sometimes just haphazardly try a lot of things and see where you can smartly fail on those. But what do you think would be good areas of focus on failing fast and failing smart?
Think about trying new things as running an experiment, and setting some objectives and goals, and thinking about, what do I want to learn from this?
Mm-hmm.
What's my intention for learning? What are my goals with trying this new approach, this new technology, whatever it is? And how will I know if it's been successful or not? What are the indicators I'm looking for, and how am I going to measure them? So thinking about how you're going to do your testing, how you're going to get feedback beforehand, and building in some time to do your reflection. And, a way of thinking about it, if anyone's working in an agile project environment, they run sprints, they run 2-week sprints. And the idea there is they think about minimum viable product. And I will be talking in my webinar tomorrow more about minimum viable product. So what's the smallest useful thing that I could put out that someone could actually use and get value out of it, that I could put out quickly? I don't have to create the whole solution, just the
Right.
smallest thing. And it might be one really good checklist as a job aid.
Right.
I might not need to create the whole learning program or the whole e-learning module, just one good checklist as a start point. How do I get that out quickly? How do I get it to users? How do I test it and get feedback from real users? How do I learn from that about what worked and what didn't? And in your normal team, you'll have a team operating rhythm where you have team meetings. Always ask at your team meetings a few key questions, such as, what's worked well for us as a team? What did we try in the past 2 weeks? What's worked well? Where could we improve? So it's building your own learning moments. I love that phrase, learning moments, that I've picked up from WD-40. Building your own learning moments consciously into your cycle. So planning to learn, I think,
Right.
and thinking of it as learning moments rather than failing, I think helps a lot.
That's amazing. Let me now capitalize on this whole idea of culture change, because I think I saw at least two change models that you presented. And what I would like to focus on is especially on the unfreezing side. So that phase wherein you're trying to motivate people to learn new things so that they will be able to incorporate that shared learning and go to the next step, right? So
Yeah.
this first tier question is about the generational differences. You know that there's a high generational differences still, because Gen X's, boomers, and also millennials who have technology in their element may have different ways by which they can adjust to transitioning to technology. My question is, in these different generations, what do you think will be their key motivation for them to actually jump into this whole new digital culture so that we can motivate them and easier compared to before?
Okay, so I'm going to send you something to share
Yes.
with your participants to add to the resources in the email. Um, I am not a strong advocate of the idea that there are significant differences between the generations in the way people learn in the workplace, in what
Right.
motivates them to learn in the workplace. And
Right.
again, it's a piece of research out of towards maturity. They do something called learner intelligence. So they do a lot of learner surveys, learner voice work with their clients. And they've got over 50,000 learner responses in their
Nice.
research database. And they produce this beautiful infographic which looks at what motivates people to learn, particularly using new technologies, what gets in the way, and what are the ways of learning that they find most effective. And they broke down the infographic by age group. And what it showed is that most of the responses, there was not a significant difference in age group. Often what makes the most difference, or what makes more difference to how people want to learn and what they want to learn, is time in role, how long they've been in a role, and their readiness for a new role. And when you think about it, that makes sense, because the things that a novice needs to learn and how they want to learn and what works for them is going to be very different to someone who's more of an expert and at the cutting edge of the domain and creating new knowledge, right? They're
Right.
different in that way. So I would think about it more in terms of time in role and readiness for next role rather than in terms of age. And you know what? I think that there's a myth around older people not being willing to embrace technology. I don't think that's true at all. And I think the data doesn't support it.
And I totally agree with you. I think there's so many factors that can be considered, barring the generational differences, especially during this time of crisis, where a lot of people are moving towards change, mainly because everyone is pushed the same way, right?
Mm.
Just one final message, probably, Michelle, that you would like to share with people in relation to your main topic, which is rethinking disruption.
Sure. The whole the sort of the rethinking learning theme.
Mhm.
Um, I've been encouraging. I went through my own journey with this. Probably started in around 2014. I spent my first 16 years of work in the Australian Air Force. And it's all very structured, all very controlled. Training is the way we do things. We have curriculum, we put people in classrooms. I then moved on when I left the Air Force to work on a lot of big infrastructure projects, and it was all about that formal learning. When I was working for Coca-Cola Amatil in around 2014, I kept hearing 70-20-10. I kept hearing people talking about Twitter as a learning tool. I'm like, I cannot get my head around this. I don't understand this. So I decided to dive in. And I did one of Jane Hart's courses. She runs the Centre for Workplace Learning. She's an amazing person to follow if people don't already follow her. HART is her surname. I did her social learning practitioner program, and within the space of 6 months, completely transformed my understanding of what real learning was about, and my personal experience of learning through connection, learning through a network, radically changed my whole approach, the approach I brought into my organization, just through reaching out and being part of a network and learning from the best by connecting with them. So when I talk about rethinking learning, it's about getting out into the network, finding examples from other people, connecting with leading practitioners who are very willing to share their knowledge and share their approaches and what works, and trying things. So this is an approach I try to bring to all of my work now, and encourage people to really get outside of their organization and have a look elsewhere and think about how can we innovate, how can we adopt new practices, and what might we do that will make a bigger impact and be really respectful about people and their knowledge.
Thank you so much for that very humble and also very insightful final message about reaching out to others who have the higher level and or same level of expertise that can be shared across the different parts of the world. Especially now that we're pushed to also reach out not just within our country, since we're all at home. A lot of us have some spare time, and we have the opportunity to reach out. That people like you, who we were I wasn't expecting, who will say yes to us immediately as soon as we presented the opportunity. So thank you, Michelle, for the time. We're a few minutes late, but we hope that we hope you had fun, and we hope that
I
you were
did, thank
also
you.
we hope you also got engaged. We will definitely share with you the chat, the Q&A parts of the information, and even the post evaluation that we will do 2 days sorry, immediately after this program. So thank you for welcoming us, and we hope we can collab with you in the future again.
My absolute pleasure, and so good to see so many people interested. Keep doing great things, everyone, and staying connected to each other.
Thank you, Michelle. And for everyone who's here, thank you for tuning in. We have around 250, I saw, attendees. And then in Facebook, on the average, there were around 80 to 90 people logging in and out through live. And I'm sure more people will see it. And just one final message from me and from PSTD. Please share this learning to a lot more people. Please follow PSTD page so that you'll be more updated. These videos are available immediately online as soon as we cut the feed. So please be generous in sharing these very free and very insightful learnings to your friends, to your family, and to other members who you think will benefit from them, because they are very useful and we need all the learning that we can get. So thank you for the session today, Michelle. Thanks for everyone who tuned in. And we hope to see you tomorrow. We have two sessions tomorrow, one at 10 a.m. and one at 2 p.m. about the roles that leaders, L&D leaders play during this time of crisis. So good evening. Good evening also, Michelle, from Queensland, and have a great week ahead. Bye.
Thank you very